Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. Thank you for joining me today. I've been looking at things God says are true about us in Christ. One of those things is that we're priests, and as priests, we're able to offer sacrifices. And that brought us to Philippians chapter 4, verse 18, which we're looking at just the end of it here. And he describes this sacrifice of giving to the need of another, as a sacrifice that's well-pleasing to God. But there's a couple of other issues. One of them had to do with contentment that we looked at yesterday. And then we have this other one that comes up in verse 19 that I think also is important. And it says, "And my God will supply all your needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus." And most of us understand that to mean, I need a new car, God provides me a new car. I need more money, God provides me more money. I need more food, God provides me more food. And that's not really, in this context, the needs to which he's referring. And if we go back to Philippians 2, which we saw yesterday, and I just want to look at this very briefly, one of the needs that he mentions in this letter is to do everything without grumbling and arguing. And there are several things that he says as you go through the letter of Philippians that demonstrates that these believers, at least some of the believers in this church, were having problems getting along while they worked or served together. In fact, some of them, the evidence is they don't want to serve together anymore. And part of the problem is when they did, they were apparently grumbling and arguing. Now, I believe that part of that problem goes back to a problem, if we go up to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 1, that they needed to stand firm in the Lord. And that's an imperative in the Greek. He says, stand firm, stand, or literally stand, take your stand in the Lord. And he's the one that's in charge, the Lord. And then he says, and picks these two ladies, I urge Euodia and Syntyche, and this word agree is to have the same frame of mind. This is what the Greek expression, they've taken this to agree, but there's several words that come together in this expression in the Greek to say to have the same frame of mind in the Lord. In other words, they needed to start thinking about each other and their circumstance in terms of who they are in Christ, but not just in Christ, but in Christ as the Lord, the one that really is in charge. In fact, he calls this other person, this true partner, to help. And that word help in the Greek is a word that means to bring them together, which demonstrates these ladies had worked. If you keep going in the verse, they had worked together, but they now need to be brought back together because apparently they don't want to work together anymore. So much so that Paul even has to tell them in verse 4 to rejoice in the Lord. And again, he says, I rejoice. And he has to tell them this more than once in this letter. You guys need to rejoice in the Lord. That's an imperative in the Greek. You guys need to do this. Come on, rejoice in him. And all of that to say that you have this conflict. And this happens in churches where people start arguing and complaining in their service. And pretty soon you have believers in the church that don't want to serve together anymore. Or maybe even worse, some of them don't want to even be at church anymore. And they go someplace else because in some way or another, they were offended by something, and it was easier for them to go someplace else than to learn to get along with other believers. And the key to getting along to other believers, and this is the need that Paul is referring to, is the need that will be met in Christ Jesus. The best evidence that he's not talking about meeting physical needs is he says he's meeting those needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. This is a need that is met in who you are in Christ. Go back and look at one of the very first videos where we talked about Ephesians 1:3. It says those are blessings in Christ. It's not material blessings God's raining down. They're blessings God gives us in Christ, in the heavenlies. These are riches, God's riches in Christ. It's not talking about his riches of gold and silver. It's talking about riches of what he says about us in Christ, or of this glory or reputation that is possible in Christ. And when you have conflict in the church, you have believers that don't want to get along, believers that don't want to work together, or maybe even believers that are walking away because their feelings have been hurt or they just don't want to do it. They have a need that God can meet, a need that he will fill up or supply in Christ. That's the need. That's the need that'll take care of the grumbling and complaining. It'll bring believers together. It's the thing that they need to have their minds set on in Christ. Maybe you've got a believer in your life or believers in your life, and you've got a problem working together with them. You can actually set your mind on who you are in Christ, and remembering that's true of them too. They also are in Christ. You are in Christ, I'm in Christ, and these are the things God says. And if this is new to you, go back and look at some of the earlier videos and look at these things that God says about us in Christ. And start building your list, or just open your New Testament and start reading through the epistles and looking at the things that God says about us in Christ and start writing them down. And start thinking that way about your brothers and sisters in Christ and you. And you'll be able to get along. And you'll be able to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me.